The setting sun illuminated the quaint suburban neighbourhood. Inside the Hartman home, the air was still and heavy. Maggie sat motionless in the old rocking chair that had been passed down generations in her family. Her eyes were fixed on her husband Ben, taking in every detail of his gaunt face as if trying to commit it to memory. The wrinkles fanning out from the corners of his eyes told stories of laughter through a life built together. Ben's body, once sturdy and strong, now appeared frail against the flower-decorated quilt draped over him. His chest rose and fell lightly with each shallow breath. The hiss of his oxygen tank and steady beeps from the heart monitor filled the silence of the room. Maggie gently squeezed Ben's slender hand, linking her fingers with his. She thought back to the day, not so long ago, when his hand, calloused from years of carpentry, had slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. They had stood under an oak tree in the backyard of Maggie's childhood home, professed their love and promised forever, and now forever was rapidly fading away. A soft knock at the door pulled Maggie from her memories. Dr. Reynolds entered quietly, his eyes immediately conveying sympathy. "Good evening, Maggie, Ben," he said gently. After a quick examination, the doctor let out a heavy sigh. "I'm afraid there's been very little change. His vital signs remain weak. We continue to keep him comfortable, but I urge you to cherish the time you have left together." Maggie nodded silently, blinking back the tears welling in her eyes. Dr. Reynolds gave her shoulder a soft, reassuring squeeze before turning to leave. "I'll be back to check on him in a few days. Call me if you need anything at all," he said. Maggie listened as the door clicked shut behind him, sealing her with the increasingly unbearable finality of Ben's fate. Maggie's gaze drifted towards the window where purples and greys were overtaking the vivid sunset. She watched as heavy raindrops began to splatter the glass, slowly at first, then rapidly intensifying to a steady downpour. The storm outside seemed to mirror the surge of emotion swirling inside her, the heartbreak, the helplessness, the sheer injustice of it all. Maggie released a shaky breath as tears spilled down her cheeks. She made no effort to wipe them away. The heavens wept with her, unleashing cold, sorrowful torrents for the ending of a beautiful life. Thunder rumbled in the distance as lightning lit up the darkening sky. The rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, as if in mourning. "I'm so sorry, my love," Maggie whispered, her voice cracking. "I wish I could take all this away and give us more time." She tenderly brushed a grey lock of hair from Ben's forehead and placed a delicate kiss there. Ben's eyes fluttered briefly, then sank close again, too weak to respond, but his lips turned up ever so slightly at her touch. Maggie clung to that faint smile, a wordless reassurance that their lifelong bond remained unbroken, even now. As Maggie held a vigil over a sleeping husband, she became aware of a new sound, barely audible beneath the storm's rumbling. It took a moment to identify the slow, irregular creaking of the front gate opening and closing. Then came the muffled footsteps down the garden path. Maggie's brows furrowed in confusion. Who would be calling in this weather so late in the evening? She gave Ben's hand a final reluctant squeeze before rising from her chair to peer out the window. Through the rain cascading down the glass, Maggie could make out a shadowy figure of an elderly man making his way laboriously up the steps to the front door. He was hunched beneath a large black coat, the hood pulled low over his elderly face. In his distorted hands, he carried what looked to be an antique grandfather clock. Maggie watched curiously as the man set the clock down gently, pausing to catch his breath. After a moment, he straightened up and knocked firmly on the door 3 times. Maggie hesitated briefly before turning the knob and opening the door. "May I help you?" she inquired, peering into the darkness, trying to make out the stranger's face beneath his hood.
"Good evening, ma'am.
The old man replied in a gravelly voice.
Please accept this gift."
Before Maggie could respond, the man bent down again with some effort to retrieve the clock. Stepping forward, he held it out for Maggie to take.
For those who truly need it, time can be a gift.
He muttered. Maggie opened the door wider, tilting her head in puzzlement, but she reached out to accept the surprisingly heavy clock from the old man. Now able to observe it closely, Maggie noted the clock's delicate craftsmanship. Elaborate engravings of vines and flowers adorned the wooden cabinet, which gave off a rich mahogany gleam, even in the low light. The brass pendulum swung steadily back and forth behind the glass door.
Remember,
The old man spoke again in barely more than a whisper.
every gift comes with a price.
A chill ran down Maggie's spine at those words. She emptied her mouth to ask what he meant, but when she lifted her eyes from the clock, she found only darkness where the stranger had been standing. Squinting into the rain, Maggie realised that the old man had vanished as swiftly as he had arrived. She pulled the door shut firmly against the howling wind and engaged both locks. With the mysterious clock still in hand, Maggie returned to the living room, moving slowly as to not wake Ben. She set the clock down gently on the sideboard and settled on the edge of the rocking chair. Maggie sat motionless once more, observing the clock's pendulum swinging steadily back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The more she stared, the more the ticking seemed to sync with the beeping of Ben's heart monitor. Tick, beep, tick, beep. Each second passing marked another moment lost. Maggie thought again of the old man's words.
For those who truly need it, time can be a gift.
Could this clock possibly provide the miracle she so desperately longed for? Maggie's pulse quickened at the dangerous thread of hope weaving its way into her grief-stricken mind. She shook her head, trying to push away the irrational thought. There was no magic cure for Ben's illness. Every doctor had said there was nothing more that could be done but to make him comfortable. Still, what did she have to lose in trying? Maggie rose from her chair. She stood in front of the clock, observing its design. After a moment, she reached out, her hand trembling, to grasp the winding key. She inserted the key into the hole at the clock's base, hesitating only a moment before beginning to turn it once, twice, 3 times. She wound the coils as far as they would go. She stepped back and watched as the swinging of the pendulum seemed to intensify ever so slightly. The clock's ticking grew louder, reverberating off the walls of the silent room. Each tick seemed imbued with purpose. Tick, a chance to hope. Tock, a moment more together. Tick, an improbable miracle. Tock, a few precious seconds gifted. Hardly daring to breathe, Maggie returned to her perch beside Ben, clinging to the arms of the rocking chair. She kept her eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of his chest, listening for any change in the cadence of his breathing. After 10 agonising minutes, Maggie detected a shift. Ben's inhales seemed to deepen ever so slightly. A touch of colour appeared in his pale cheeks. The lines in his forehead relaxed as tension released from his body. Maggie froze, unsure if her fatigued mind was playing tricks on her. But over the next hour, the changes became unmistakable. Ben's complexion grew rosier, his breath stronger. He began to stir, his head turning gently side to side on the pillow. The rain tapered off, giving way to glimpses of moonlight that spilled across Ben's resting form. The swinging pendulum of the clock appeared to glow with each pass. As dawn broke, the moonlight washed over the room. Maggie held her own breath as Ben's eyelids slowly opened. He blinked slowly, glancing around in momentary confusion. "Good morning, my love," Maggie finally exhaled, a hesitant smile spreading across her face. "Maggie?" Ben rasped. "What day is it?" "It's Tuesday. How are you feeling?" Ben considered the question. Oddly, quite well rested, and rather hungry actually. Maggie's grin broadened, relief and disbelief washing over her. She helped prop Ben up against his pillows and hurried to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, Soon she was listening in wonder as he polished off toast, eggs, and a cup of tea. The doctor arrived later that morning, immediately rushing to examine Ben with shock written across his kind face. He listened to Ben's heart and lungs, took his temperature and blood pressure, shone lights in his eyes, all with increasing surprise. "This is truly remarkable," the doctor muttered. "There's no medical explanation for an overnight reversal like this. Yesterday he was on the brink, and now it's like he has the constitution of a healthy young man." Maggie just nodded, unable to find words to explain the unfathomable events of the previous night. As the day progressed, Ben's return to strength appeared undeniable. He was able to sit up without assistance, then to take a few gentle steps around the room, then to walk slowly with Maggie's arm supporting him to the back window. Together they stood gazing out at the oak tree, leaves glistening after the rain, where they had spoken their vows of forever a lifetime ago. Ben gave Maggie's shoulder a grateful squeeze. "This feels like a second chance, Mags," he said softly. "Maybe our forever isn't over just yet." Maggie smiled up at her husband, a flicker of hope and wonder igniting inside her. But as her eyes drifted over to the clock, still ticking steadily on the sideboard, she recalled the ominous words spoken by the stranger in the night.
Every gift comes with a price.
Amid the cautious optimism provoked by Ben's improbable recovery, those words lingered like a dark cloud on the horizon. Maggie shivered, a knot of apprehension coiling in her stomach. Glancing between her husband and the ticking clock, a single terrifying question consumed her thoughts. What price would she be forced to pay for this gift of time? A hushed reverence filled the living room as a rosy sunset light filtered through the lace curtains. Maggie sat motionless in her grandmother's antique rocker, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her gaze was transfixed on the large grandfather clock, standing solemnly in the corner. As the last slither of sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie leaned forward and stood slowly, knees creaking. She approached the clock purposefully, withdrew the winding key from its place on the sideboard, and inserted it into the brass hole located just above the pendulum. Turning the key with great care, Maggie wound the clock's coils 3 times. Listening closely to the clicking of the gears, she stepped back and watched as the swinging of the pendulum gained momentum, slicing through the evening silence. Tick, tock, tick, tock. This winding ritual had become Maggie's nightly ceremony ever since the clock arrival 5 nights ago. It seemed this act was somehow gifting Ben more time, though Maggie dared not to dwell too long on the how and why. Each turn of the key granted one more sunrise with her beloved husband. That was miracle enough. Satisfied the clock was wound sufficiently for the evening, Maggie returned the winding key to its rightful place. She made her way down the dim hallway to the closed door of the bedroom she shared with Ben. Rapping her knuckles lightly before entering, she called out, "Decent in there?" "Decent as I'll ever be," came Ben's muffled reply, followed by a rumbling chuckle. Maggie entered to find Ben sitting up in his bed, scanning the newspaper by lamplight. His skin had lost its pale appearance, practically glowing with renewed vitality. Grey strands still speckled his dark hair, but they seemed to shine, no longer dull and limp. Ben peered at Maggie over his reading glasses. "Care to join me for the crossword?" he asked, patting the spot beside him on the quilt. Maggie smiled, settling onto the bed. Ben's warmth radiated as she leaned against him. They sat together quietly, heads bowed in concentration over the puzzle, shoulders touching. The only sounds were the scratching of a pen and the distant ticking that gently permeated the old walls. Eventually, the newspaper slipped from Ben's fingers as he dozed off. Maggie set the finished crossword aside and reached to turn off the lamp. She sat awake in the darkness for some time, listening to her husband's deep, steady breathing before finally drifting to sleep. When the morning sunshine streamed in through the lace curtains, Maggie stirred slowly, her eyes fluttered open. It took a moment to identify the unfamiliar sensations she felt. For the first time in months, her body was not wrecked with the bone-deep exhaustion that had plagued her throughout Ben's illness. She felt rejuvenated. Sitting up, Maggie glanced across at Ben's still sleeping form. The lines that had creased his face in pain just days before were relaxed. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm with the deep breaths of restful sleep. Though her mind still buzzed with the restless curiosity about the mysterious old man and his clock, Maggie shoved the thoughts aside. She leaned down to plant a tender kiss on Ben's forehead before slipping quietly from the room. Humming softly to herself, Maggie prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal topped with sliced bananas and cinnamon. 2 mugs of steaming coffee sat ready on the table as Ben shuffled into the kitchen. His tousled hair and robe earning a grin from Maggie. "Morning, sleepyhead," she teased. "Smells heavenly in here," Ben said, inhaling deeply as he took a seat. They ate together unhurriedly, sharing a section of the newspaper and chatting about an upcoming visit from their daughter Emily. The home comfort of it all felt so beautifully ordinary that Maggie could never forget the strangeness of the past week. Nearly, but not completely. After tidying up the breakfast dishes, Maggie stood inspectingly in the hall mirror, searching for any small change. She leaned forward, examining her complexion in the bright morning light. Were those new fine lines forming in the corner of her eyes? Wishful thinking, she shouted to herself. With a shake of her head, Maggie turned from the mirror. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder as she passed by the living room doorway, causing Maggie to pause. She stood motionless, listening to the relentless rhythm that now perpetually pervaded their home. A familiar unease began twisting its way through her stomach. Maggie forced herself to continue down the hall. She had chores to complete and errands to run today. There was no use in fretting over what couldn't be changed. Ben needed her to be strong. After bundling up against the autumn chill, Maggie set out to accomplish her tasks. She returned home hours later, arms laden with groceries, to find Ben flipping through an old photo album in the living room. "You look like you were busy today," he said. "Just restocking the essentials." Maggie nodded towards the kitchen before making her way down the hall to put the cold items in the fridge. As she passed by the mirror this time, she kept her gaze averted, but she couldn't help but notice what seemed more like strands of silver glinting in her auburn hair. "You're being ridiculous, Maggie," scolding herself. And yet, returning to look over Ben's shoulder at the photo album, the changes were unmistakable. In pictures from just a month ago, Ben's complexion was pale and eyes were sunken with illness. Now his skin practically glowed, his eyes vibrant and alive. Meanwhile, if Maggie looked closely, faint creases and crow's feet seemed etched a little deeper around her eyes. She could swear the glow of youthful vitality her skin once possessed was slowly diminishing each day. But a gift asks no question, Maggie reminded herself firmly. Every additional moment with Ben was worth any cost. Surely her mind was playing tricks on her. She was simply exhausted from the emotional toil of recent months. Still, an insidious whisper lingered in the back of her mind. What price will you pay for borrowed time? Pushing aside her concerns, Maggie busied herself with preparing dinner and straightening up the house. Ben fell asleep early, still regaining his strength. Alone with her thoughts in the encroaching darkness, Maggie's disquaint returned. The distant ticking of the clock seemed louder tonight, almost taunting. Unable to resist any longer, she stood again before the hallway mirror under the harsh overhead light. Leaning forward until her nose nearly touched the glass, Maggie scrutinized every inch of her reflection. There could be no doubt now. Faint but unmistakable creases marred her once smooth forehead. Crow's feet fanned out from the corners of her eyes. Her rosy complexion had faded to a dull paleness. As Maggie tilted her head, the light illuminated streaks of grey scattered throughout her auburn waves. Stepping back in dismay, Maggie blinked rapidly against the stinging in her eyes. This couldn't be happening, not now. When she had just gotten Ben back, it felt like some twisted practical joke, giving with one hand and taking away with the other. A knocking at the front door startled Maggie from her distressing observations. She hurried to peer through the living room curtains, surprised to see an elderly neighbour standing on the porch holding a casserole dish. Maggie plastered a smile on her face before opening the door to the unexpected visitor. "Good evening, Maggie dear. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I made a nice tuna casserole and thought I'd bring some over." Mrs. Werner held the dish out with slightly trembling hands. Maggie noticed the older woman's eyebrows knit together as she looked over her critically. "That's very kind of you. Please, do come in." Maggie stepped aside and ushered Mrs. Werner into the living room. "Let me take your coat. Can I get you some tea?" "No tea for me, dear. I won't be staying long. I just wanted to check in on you both." There was a weighted pause before she continued gently. "Maggie, are you feeling alright? You look so very tired lately." "I'm quite alright, Mrs. Werner. It's kind of you to worry, but no need. Probably just not sleeping well." She hoped her smile looked more convincing than it felt. Mrs. Werner continued to study her with a concerned frown, but simply nodded. "Well, let me know if you need anything at all. Get some rest." After seeing the woman to the door, Maggie sagged back against it with a heavy sigh. She had a sinking feeling that Mrs. Werner's visit was only the first of many concerned check-ins to come. Over the next week, Maggie's suspicion proved correct. The mail carrier paused to inquire about her health. Friends from church dropped off meals and remained to examine her appearance. Neighbours seemed to find small excuses to pop in unannounced. Their comments were well-intentioned, but each interaction left Maggie feeling more self-conscious. She began avoiding venturing out or answering the door when possible. At night, Maggie turned off all the lights to avoid catching a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She began waking before dawn to hide the grey strands emerging from her hair. Concealer became her closest companion, dutifully masking the deepening creases in her skin. The crow's feet crept slowly outward from Maggie's hazel eyes. Her youthful glow continued to fade day by day, and all the while the ticking of the clock marched steadily on, reminding her there are consequences for tampering with time. Maggie hardly dared to dwell on the further changes tomorrow might bring, but she would bear this burden gladly if it meant even one more ordinary, perfect day with Ben. As long as she still had that, they could face tomorrow together, whatever that may hold. A heavy silence engulfed the Hartman home, punctuated only by the relentless ticking emanating from the grandfather clock. Maggie sat motionless in the darkened bedroom, hands folded neatly in her lap. She stared absently at the unfamiliar face gazing back from the vanity mirror across from her. The glass reflected an elderly woman with paper-thin skin etched with wrinkles, wispy white hair, and clouded eyes. This was the price Maggie had paid for time. While the mysterious clock gifted life back to Ben, it gradually drained hers away. It had been 6 months since the clock's arrival. After the first subtle changes, Maggie's deterioration rapidly accelerated. Her body weakened, her hair greyed, her smooth skin withered. Liver spots emerged on her hands that could barely grasp a teacup without shaking. At just 38 on the inside, Maggie felt ancient and worn on the outside. She moved carefully now, often relying on a cane for support. Simple joys like gardening and reading brought only frustration as her vision clouded more and more each day. But every night, she faithfully made her way to the clock. Maggie wound its coils again and again, fueled by a desperate love for the man asleep down the hall. Ben's heartbreak at watching his once vibrant wife deteriorate was eclipsed by only his profound gratitude for the gift of time she had selflessly provided him. He adored Maggie as she struggled through days that felt increasingly meaningless. They never spoke of the clock now. Its power hung like a spectator in the background of their lives, revered and feared. As if summoned by her thoughts, the bedroom door creaked open. Ben entered slowly, his salt and pepper hair dishevelled from sleep. Kneeling beside Maggie's chair with great care, he took one of her frail hands in both of his own. She noted with bittersweet joy that his skin practically glowed with health. "How are you feeling today, my love?" Ben asked, as his eyes full of warmth and sorrow. "As well as can be expected," Maggie replied, managing a thin smile. Ben nodded, blinking back tears as he gave her hand a tender squeeze. "You rest. I'll bring you some breakfast." He stood slowly, joints creaking just slightly as he made his way towards the door. Maggie watched him go, her heart swelling with gratitude for these precious moments together. Yet at the same time, she mourned all they had lost. Later, as winter light filtered into the bedroom, Maggie heard a familiar scrape and thump of the mail slot opening and closing, followed by Ben's approaching footsteps. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, holding a plain white envelope. His brow creased anxiously as he turned it over in his hands. "This came for you, Mags, from the University Medical Centre." Maggie sighed heavily, reaching out a quivering hand. She carefully tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter within. Her clouded eyes strained to make out the words. Test results, abnormal cells, suspected tumour, additional testing required." The clinical language barely penetrated the fog of Maggie's thoughts these days, but the implications were clear enough. Her body was failing. It was only a matter of time. Maggie crushed the letter tightly in her fist before letting it fall forgotten to the floor. She had no tears left to shed. In truth, a part of her felt more relief than sorrow. A finite ending to her suffering was in sight. But looking up at Ben, creases of agony lining his face, Maggie knew she could not leave him yet. Not when she possessed the power to turn back the clock once more, whatever the cost. Maggie strengthened her resolve. When the sun set and the shadows returned, she would wind the coils again and again. She would not stop until the clock could give no more, until time itself was drained away, leaving Ben what remained of hers. She would not, could not, watch him suffer again. The daylight hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Ben tended to Maggie as best he could, speaking little but conveying love with each gentle touch. As the first faint twinkling of stars appeared, Ben knelt and gathered Maggie's frail, small frame into his arms. He carried her with aching care to the living room, where the clock stood waiting in the shadows. At Maggie's whispered request, Ben brought her the winding key. She clutched it in her aching hands, drawing an irregular breath. Their eyes met in silent exchange. Love merged with sorrow. With great effort, Maggie inserted the key into its hole. Mustering her last remnants of strength, she began winding once, twice, again and again. Far beyond the usual capacity, the clock buzzed intensely in protest. But Maggie did not cease until the coils could turn no further. Withdrawing footsteps told Maggie she was alone. With her final task complete, darkness crept across her vision. The clock's ticking faded away, replaced by the slow, steady beating of her heart. Thump, thump, thump. Each fouling contraction brought Maggie closer to the inevitable stillness ahead. She felt no fear, only a sense of profound peace. As Maggie's breathing gradually softened and slowed, her thoughts turned to Ben. She prayed the extra time she had brought for him, however long that may be, would bring joy and purpose. Maggie's final conscious moments were filled with tender memories and a timeless love. The images flickered by like photographs, capturing all that had truly mattered in this world. A lanky boy with unruly hair and kind eyes holding her as they walked home from school. An outdoor wedding under the oak tree. A little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin bouncing on her father's shoulders. A quiet moment curled up reading together. A life intertwined through happiness and heartache. As the memories faded, Maggie surrendered to the darkness. The clock's incessant ticking ceased abruptly. All was still. Her sacrifice was complete. A heavy stillness pervaded the shadowy living room. The antique clock stood frozen, hands motionless. Pendulum halted its swing. Nearby, in her rocking chair, Maggie's lifeless form was slumped in eternal rest. Ben slowly approached his wife's body, each step heavy with grief. Kneeling before her, he gently brushed a wisp of white hair from her peaceful face. Tracing the etched wrinkles in her skin, he planted a long, tender kiss on her forehead. "Be at peace now, my darling," he whispered. "No more suffering." He rose and stood for a long moment before the clock that had proven their salvation and their undoing. Reaching out, he gripped the motionless pendulum. The metal was icy to the touch. With great care, Ben extracted the winding key from Maggie's rigid hand. He turned it over slowly in his palm, reflecting. This instrument held within it both life and death. Each turn of its coil could restore vitality and siphon it away. Ben's fingers closed tightly around the key as he stared at the clock's motionless face, frozen forever at 4:22. The room silent now. No swinging pendulum marked the relentless march of time. For this brief pause, eternity was held captive, waiting, silent. Ben pictured Maggie's smile, playful and loving. He heard her musical laugh echoing through their home. His heart swelled with memories of a life shared to its fullest. There would never be enough time with his beloved, but the time they'd had was a gift. With eyes glistening, Ben placed a thankful kiss on the clock's wooden frame. He then opened his hand, letting the winding key fall to the floor with a dull clatter. Turning quietly, he left the stillness behind. The clock's frozen hand could not turn back, only forward, and life's remaining moments were meant to be lived. So Ben stepped out to meet the dawn, warmed by the rising sun. He tucked away the gift of borrowed time that Maggie's sacrifice had granted. Now he would live out her legacy and wait patiently until they met again, where the hands of time could touch them no more.